Okay, we're beginning our study of Job today, and we're not using any particular material. We're just going to go through section by section. I don't intend to.
Oh, that doesn't work. That's not a bad.
Here, just goodness, come on, take this. I don't intend to take every single verse apart in great detail. What we really want to do is get an understanding for, what is the lesson? What are the chief lessons that the book of Job is teaching us? And so, by way of introduction, we all know the basic story of Job, where Job was a good man and God has an argument, or as a bet, so to speak. Not exactly a wager, but as near as you can come to the Divine Counsel, and in God's Divine Counsel to a bet, where the accuser comes and says, well, if Job is only a good man because you have been so gracious to him, because you blessed him with so much earthly wealth, and he has nothing to be sad about. He has nothing to be angry at God about. There's no reason to curse you. But the accuser then says, but the accuser's position is that Job is a sinner because he's a son of Adam. He's born in sin, and therefore he is like all other sons of Adam. If he did not think his life so well, he would curse you. He would no longer believe in you. He would no longer have faith. So, and then of course we know what follows. And as things proceed, of course, and Job loses everything, then he has the three friends who come. The bulk of the book is a conversation in verse form, in the form of Hebrew poetry, between the three friends of Job and Job himself, where the three friends are trying to convince Job, you're not a righteous man. God has not declared you righteous. You have a sin that you must confess that is responsible for your suffering. And therefore, if only you confess that sin, then you would be blessed. And so the implication there, of course, is that if you are free from any hidden sins, if you've confessed them all, then you will not suffer or endure temptation. That's the premise of the friends of Job. And Job's response consistently is to cling to God's promise, even though Job begins to hate his life in this world. The great temptation is not that he hates and despises his life, or later, as we see, curses the day that he was born, but that he curses, but whether or not he believes that God holds him righteous in the only place that matters before the throne in heaven. And so Job takes us into a place that we don't normally get to see, which you could almost call the Divine Counsel. Some modern theologians have called it this, but it's just simply recognizing the fact that God is not simply alone in heaven. He has other spiritual creatures there with him, through which he operates in the world. Just in a similar fashion to how God works through men in the world to carry out his will. Well, God does the same thing with his spiritual creation as well. And so we're starting with chapter 1, where we're introduced to Job. And today we'll try to get through the first chapter here, but we can break off early if we need to. There was a man in the land of Uz, whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. The land of Uz is somewhere east of Palestine. So, Uz, not Oz, Uz. And so, it's an area where most of the people lived a nomadic life, and so you had your great flocks and herds that you traveled from place to place with. All right. So what does it say? His name was Job. There's no specific intention behind the meaning of his name as far as our text is concerned. That man was blameless, upright, who feared God and turned away from evil. And so you've got two couplets here. Blameless and upright, he feared God and turned away from evil. These are the strongest terms that the Hebrew text could use to describe Job's righteousness. The idea of blameless is the idea of there is no sin that could be held to Job's account. Well, as we'll see later, then why is Job sacrificing? Already in verse 1, or in this first chapter, we can see why Job is righteous and upright, because he lives by faith. God himself has pronounced Job righteous in his divine counsel. And Job believes God's judgment. And his life reflects that judgment. But you'll notice as we see how the life of Job reflects that judgment, it's somewhat similar to what we're talking about in our sermon today. Job recognizes sin and righteousness being at the same time present in God's people. He's constantly aware of it, in fact. So as we'll see that in his behavior. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters, so he had 10 children. He possessed 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 female donkeys, and very many servants. 10 children, and 1 wife. And so even in many ways in which his fellow nomads, the Arabs of the area, would have sinned, Job did not. The description of these flocks, they're huge. 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels. I mean, imagine a shepherd today, even a modern shepherd having 7,000 sheep to care for. That's a massive number. So Job is especially by the standards of his day, an exceptionally rich man. He's beyond compare to all of his peers in this area of the world. Nobody else can compare. Very many servants. So the man was the greatest of all the people of the East. His sons used to go and hold a feast in the house of each one on his day. Now, as far as what on his day means, we're not exactly sure if it's
7 sons each day of the week.
Well, I don't know that it means each day of the week necessarily. It's a question. Some people think it's his birthday, their birthdays.
Yeah,
and so that was that's one of the possibilities, and I think that's probably the most likely case here. But suffice it to say, they would hold these feasts, and they happened often enough throughout the year. They would invite their sisters to come eat and drink with them. And when the days of the feast had run their course, so you see days, plural, so it can't be 1 per week.
Right.
So this is most likely a celebration of the day of their birth. Job would send and consecrate them, and he would rise up early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." This Job did continually. It's interesting that the word curse here is actually a euphemism. The word they're using is actually for blessing. And he's using it in the opposite sense here. It's kind of like, the southern thing, "Well, bless your heart." That's the way Job is using the word here in this sense. Job doesn't have any evidence that his children did evil, but he knows that they were partying for a week. And he says it may be that in their hearts they cursed God, especially since there's sure to be alcohol involved. And so he offers burnt offerings and sacrifices for them. He brings, and notice it specifically says he would send and consecrate them. He would bring them together for worship so that he would burn the sacrifices on their behalf for the forgiveness of their sins. He wants his children to have the same righteous relationship before God that he does. And so he is also a good father. And he recognizes the sin not only in himself, but also in his children, that they need the same divine judgment that he has. Thus, Job did continually. Now, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan, or literally it's literally the accuser, came before them. The word Satan is not a name, by the way. In later writings, it had come to be associated with the tempter in the garden, the devil. However, the name itself simply means the accuser, and it speaks of one who has this as their purpose. Their purpose is to identify and accuse someone of their sins before God. And so, most of the translations simply translate it Satan. But one could consider that this creature was doing the job that God had sent him to do in one sense. That is, accuse. Showing that the sins of man are held accountable to him. So that if you picture heaven as a court of judgment, you've got a district attorney bringing the charge against the accused. So that's what the accuser's doing. And so just keep that in mind so that when we see this, it's not a specific name being used, but the accuser. The one of the group of creatures called the sons of God, known as the accuser.
Is he supposed, that's just so that we keep in mind that he could be exclusive from what we traditionally refer to as Satan?
Yes. It doesn't, yeah, it's possible that this is not specifically referring to the tempter in the garden.
Okay.
Yeah. It doesn't mean it's not him, by the way, because he certainly has that function as well.
Right.
Right.
Because there's plenty of points in the gospel where he's referred to as the accuser.
As the accuser. And as well as in other places in Revelation, for example, he's referred to as, where after the resurrection of Christ, there was no longer a place found for the accuser in heaven. He couldn't accuse anymore because Christ had risen and he was cast out. Isaiah? No. But that's an interesting question, though. Not the 10 beasts, the 4 beasts. Yeah, that's an interesting question, though. We don't know exactly what type of angelic creature, what type of spiritual creature Satan was, but he does seem to be. There is evidence that Satan was one of the seraphs. We're not sure, but based upon the etymology of his name, a throne guardian type creature, like what we see in Isaiah chapter 6. Satan could have been one of those, which would also make sense because their names are described in a the words for serpent and shining are related in the scriptures, and so we always throw out any idea you have of what one of the seraphims look like. The classic depictions are nothing like that.
Much taller angels.
They may have a roughly humanoid form, but the grammar has them described more almost a serpentine, glowing, shining form. Yeah. And now we have the serpent in the garden. And you think about it now, serpents have also obviously have taken on the connotation of being connected to evil, but they clearly were not originally. They were a creation of God and as part of the original good creation. And anyway, so that's kind of a side track.
Kind of
That's
see
a
here in Job,
revelation study.
or in Genesis, the same thing you see here in Job. Like, it could have been that Satan, or the accuser, believed righteous because they don't know what unrighteousness is. They don't know what sin is, so they're only holy because they can't possibly know what sin is or what
If they've not been tempted, I think the general argument is he hasn't been tempted enough to commit any great sins.
Yeah,
he knows what sin is, so that's the difference
Genesis,
between Genesis.
like Adam and Eve don't know sin, so how can you tell if they're righteous if they don't have a chance to
except
be
that
unrighteous?
what you see happening in Genesis chapter 3 is this creature is lying.
Mm-hmm.
And he tells the best kind of lies. He tells you lies that are true by hiding what the truth really means.
Yep.
And so, yes, they will be like gods, knowing both good and evil, for example. That wasn't, strictly speaking, a lie. But then when he speaks of, you will not surely die, in the strictest sense, that also was not a lie, except that's not the kind of death God meant. And he knew it. So, all right. So, we have here in verse 6 this curious term, the sons of God. This term is used in two different ways in Scripture. One way in the Old Testament, one way in the New Testament. In the Old Testament, the sons of God, as here, is clearly referring to before God's throne. These are, you can call it the counterpart in the spiritual world to what we are now as Christians on the earth. In the New Testament, the sons of God only ever refers to Christians. And in fact, Paul makes the point, he says, now we are the sons of God. And so, this is part of a whole picture throughout the Bible that God has his spiritual counsel and through which he goes out and carries out his will in the world. He doesn't need them. He doesn't need anybody. He doesn't need us, and yet he wants us. God doesn't need man to exercise his will in the world, but he wants to use man to work through the means of man's actions in the world to carry out his will. The same thing is true in the spiritual realm. God doesn't need the angels. He doesn't need the seraphim. He doesn't need whatever other spiritual creatures, they're called the watchers in certain places. You see a reference to that in the book of Jude, in Daniel, I think, where you have a similar thing. In the case of Belteshazzar, I think, was it Belteshazzar or Nebuchadnezzar, where it says the judgment, God is passing judgment, and yet it describes it as the judgment of the watchers, which seems to be the same group as the sons of God. So in other words, God is carrying out his judgment and passing, making a determination in heaven among this group. You'll see a reference to this throughout the scriptures where it doesn't just say that there's one throne in heaven. There's one high throne, but there are many other thrones around them. In the Old Testament, it speaks of the thrones being set. What does Jesus talk about those thrones in the New Testament? He says now the apostles will sit on the thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And so the sons of God are just, the angelic type creatures are displaced by mankind himself. We are higher than the angels, in other words, because this group, the sons of God, is higher than the angels. But remember, the angels are the messenger creatures. These are a greater creature yet. All right, so so the point here is you've got an entire divine council in heaven declaring Job righteous, and God himself at the head, because he's the creator of all. All right, so continue. The Lord said to Satan, "From where have you come?" Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth and from walking up and down on it." And of course, you'd expect if the accuser has this as his role to accuse, then the primary thing he's going to be doing is going and watching what everybody is doing. Watching for sin. And the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil? And so there's that exact same description repeated from verse 1. Then Satan answered the Lord and said, does Job fear God for no reason? In other words, Satan grants that Job is upright, fears God. But his question is, but is it for no reason? In other words, is it because he's good or just because he hasn't had opportunity to do otherwise? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face. All right. Again, the proposition is, take away all the good things you've given him. Take away the protections that you have put in place. And so you'll notice that it speaks of God's having put a hedge around. What's the purpose of a hedge? Is to protect the vineyard, for example, protect the property like a fence or a tall wall. So Satan is speaking of God is actively keeping evil away from Job. But if he'd stop doing that, then Job would no longer be righteous. He would curse God. And the Lord said to Satan, behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. In other words, you may not take Job's life, but you can do anything else you want. So, now there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. One of these feasts that were referenced in earlier in the first few verses. And there came a messenger to Job and said, the oxen were plowing, and the donkeys feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans fell upon them, and took them, and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. And this word servants is the young men. So Job had, the younger men were the ones keeping the flocks. And while that person was still speaking, another came and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. And while he was yet speaking, there came another and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 groups and made a raid on the camels and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. That's the third one. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking in their oldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young people, and they are dead, and I alone have escaped to tell you. Then Job arose. So in other words, that was everything. That was all of his great possessions, gone in a day along with all of his children and all of his servants, but just a handful. Then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head and fell on the ground and worshipped. So in a single day, you cannot imagine a greater tragedy falling upon a person in a single day than this. I mean, in the scriptures, we don't see a greater example of tragedy striking just one person. And so when the accuser, when Satan let loose, he let loose with everything he could, up to within limits. Job's wife, by the way, seems to be protected by God's prohibition, which I find interesting, because God considered Job and his wife one flesh. Job's life was protected. That included his wife's life. And so it's really just the two of them now.
Or could it have been that Satan had a greater reason for him, because later, or for her, because later he has
he does, but
telling.
he does, but I think it's more telling. Yes, his wife becomes the one who tempts Job later. That's true. But I think it's quite telling that in one stroke, he took everything away from him that he could. And it's curious that the wife alone was left. And Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head. These are, the classic, the tearing of the garment is throughout the ancient Near Eastern world a sign of mourning, of sorrow, suffering. And so you see it all throughout, where somebody, various people, they tear their clothing as a sign of suffering. Shaved his head and fell on the ground and worshipped. And he said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. And so you see, when he says this, he's confessing that he didn't deserve any of the gifts that he had. All that excessive riches, he looked as purely from the mercy of God. So in other words, Job as a man recognized that God did not give him that tremendous wealth because Job was a better man than all of his peers. Otherwise he would say, "Lord, why have you taken away from me all these things that I have worked so hard to acquire and earn? Am I not an upright and righteous man before you? Why are you taking away all that I have, even my children?" But Job recognizes that even though he is the divine pronouncement of his righteousness, he does not deserve anything that he has. And so Job is distinguishing between what we deserve in ourselves and what we receive purely out of God's mercy. And so you've got an amazing declaration of the distinction between God's law and his gospel here, and the fact that we are righteous only by faith. Job's righteousness before God was by faith in his God. God counted Job righteous because he believed him. In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. So, there is the opening salvo. And of course, this is, it continues because... What? What? Speak up.
And we read more.
We're going to read this much today.
Yeah.
And then we have, we'll start chapter 2 next time, since we want to get moving here early. So. Oh, okay. And we might, when we get to chapter 2, we might come back and touch on a couple more things in chapter 1.
Does that mean God punished Satan?
We're not told about the accuser or Satan being punished at all.
Because the accuser didn't do anything that God didn't send him to do. He granted.
Well, presumably, we have to be careful and say that this could or this may or may not be referring to the tempter in the garden, the Satan in the garden, the devil.
But God granted the accuser the power to do this. So.
Well, that's true, but you also have to consider that God allows evil to take place in the world, except he turns it to his own good.
Yes.
And so just because God allows evil to happen doesn't mean that the agent who brings that evil is righteous for doing so. So you got to remember that.
But that also doesn't mean that he is punished for doing that. Did you
Correct.
say it was Satan?
Well, I know that's true. It doesn't mean